Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm about to start a video series about child ballads, and because I've been talking a little bit about mermaids this past month, my first topic is child ballads about mermaids and water spirits. So the first question you might have is, what on earth is a child ballad? And you might very reasonably assume that that means it's a ballad for children. You could not be more wrong if that's what you're thinking. A lot of these are not child-friendly whatsoever. The name actually comes from Francis James Child, who was a 19th century folklorist who collected a lot of ballads. He gave them all numbers and put letters for different variants, so like there's version 1A, 1B, and so on. And they're called child ballads because his last name was Child. These ballads often come from England, Scotland, or the United States, and in many cases they have variants from various places. So, like for instance, there might be an English variant and then an American variant with some differences between them. Ballads in the traditional sense are basically songs that tell stories. Some of these are very short, some of them are very long in comparison to what we would normally think of as a normal length modern song. But regardless, they always tell some kind of story. And that's often a love story, but certainly not always, and the ones that we're going to look at today, actually, none of them are love stories. The ballads collected by Francis James Child cover a huge variety of topics, and they range from being totally realistic and plausible to completely supernatural. There were 3 that I was able to find that deal specifically with mermaids or water spirits of some kind. In 2 of them, the word mermaid is specifically used, and in the 3rd one, it's a selkie. Child Ballad 42 has different variants that are called either Clark Colvin, Clerk Colville, or Clerk Colvin, and the names don't really matter, they're all pretty similar, and they all refer to the same character. So there's this guy, Clark or Clerk, whose lover tells him not to go to a specific body of water, because it's implied that there is some danger there. And, of course, because, nobody takes good advice in ballads, he goes there anyway, and he sees a mermaid. And then the mermaid speaks to him and he says that his head is in pain, and she gives him a solution to that doesn't really work. And eventually he goes home and he sees his family and his lover, and he basically, it's implied, dies because of his encounter with the mermaid. Now in some of the variants it's just implied that he died. In one it's specifically stated, and he's actually given a choice by the mermaid to go be with her or to die, and he chooses not to go with her. Regardless, going to see the mermaid turns out to be fatal for him. Contrary to what Disney, for instance, would have you believe, mermaids in older folklore are often considered to be signs of misfortune. And so in Clerk Colvin, or whichever variant, whatever name you want to call it, it's implied that the mermaid is responsible for what happens to him. In Child Ballad 289, it's a little bit more ambiguous, but there's this ship that's sailing and the crew sees a fair pretty maid with a comb and a glass in her hand, or in some versions, a mermaid with a comb and a glass in her hand, and then the ship gets caught in a storm and sinks. And the ballad is basically about the people on the ship mourning the fact that their wives back home, or in the case of the cabin boy, his parents back home, will never see them again. So it's not 100% spelled out that the mermaid sank the ship, but seeing the mermaid and then the storm coming implies that there's some connection there between the mermaid and what happens, if only that she's a bad omen. There are variants of this ballad that don't actually say within the ballad itself that the woman that they see is a mermaid, but that's very clearly what's implied. And do you know how I know that? Because the title of the ballad is usually given as The Mermaid. Interestingly, even though mermaids are often associated with shipwrecks and drowning and just misfortune at sea in general, these ballads don't associate them with what we normally think of when we think of mermaids being responsible for that, which is sitting on the rocks and singing and luring the ship to its doom. Now, that's not something that actually originates from mermaids. It's a siren thing, as in the sirens from the Odyssey and other parts of Greek mythology. The sirens in Greek mythology were not mermaids, they were actually bird women who sat on the rocks, and, it makes a little bit more sense. Bird women sitting on the rocks out of the water, as opposed to women with fishtails. But as I discussed in one of my other videos, which I will put a link to, mermaids and sirens have been seriously confused over time. And so by the time that these ballads were being sung and written down, the 2 concepts were very, very closely intertwined. The concept of mermaids being dangerous to humans and being responsible for deaths at sea hints at connections to siren mythology, but the actual way that it plays out is a little bit different in that they just see her and then there's a storm, as opposed to being lured off course. And then the third ballad that I wanted to talk about today is number 113, which is The Great Silkie of Sulskeri. And this is a story about a Selkie. Selkies are creatures from Scottish folklore that basically take the form of a seal in the ocean, but can come on land as a human. So they're shapeshifters. They're not like half and half in the way that mermaids are. They just change form depending on whether they're on land or in the ocean. And when they come on land, they remove their seal skin. So if a human were to take the seal skin and hide it, the Selkie would be unable to return to the ocean. That's a concept that features prominently in a lot of Selkie stories, and it's not really relevant here, but just to sort of set the stage for what's going on here, that's a common thing. And the idea that Selkies might marry and or have children with humans is also a pretty common thing in Selkie folklore, although usually it looks a little bit different than it does here. So in Child Ballad 113, this woman has a child and she doesn't know who the father is, which of course, in that society would have been pretty taboo. And so one day this guy shows up and tells her that he is her child's father. Now, she had no idea. It doesn't seem that her lover was a Selkie, but he takes the child with him when he goes back to the ocean, and he makes a prediction when he leaves that she will get married to a gunner who will someday shoot him and their son. The other way that these stories usually go in folk tales is something along the lines of a group of Selkie women are on land and this guy takes one of the seal skins, and so one of the Selkies has to stay behind because she can't go back to the ocean without it, and they get married, but he hides the skin so that she won't ever be able to go back to the ocean, and eventually their child finds it and shows it to her, and she puts it on and leaves. So clearly the idea of a human woman having a child with a Selkie man was portrayed very differently from the reverse. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'm going to be talking more about child ballads in the upcoming months, so if that's something you're interested in, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos on Mondays and Thursdays.